Joanna. Joe. Hi. From across the first-floor corridor Joe smiled, though her mind was still within the boardroom that she had just left. Staring at the now-closed, wood-paneled door, then back at Chandler, who was calling her, she folded her arms and smiled again. "So," he said, walking to her, and nodding his head towards the boardroom door. "How did it go?" Joe didn't say anything for a moment. She smiled again, and began to walk down the corridor whence Chandler had come. "Okay, I think," she said eventually, swallowing down the last of her nerves. "I did what I practiced with you, I got my point across. The board of directors asked me what I believe are pertinent questions. I was thanked for my time to propose such an interesting idea supported by an array of evidence." It was Tuesday, 5 days after Chandler, as good as his word, had driven her back to Mitchell, home of the caravans and other ephemeral humanity. She had been grateful that he had, and grateful too that he hadn't pressed the point that, as deputy project manager, she had chosen to live there. It was tough, though, considering the apartment that she had stayed in, even a basic one like that was infinitely better than the caravan, which swayed in high winds and through whose walls she could hear the Thompson family next door, through their wall. "So, they said they'd get back to you?" Chandler pressed, as Joanna felt herself sagging. She looked up to him, and nodded. Then, she added, "I'm sorry, Chandler. I've been up most of the night trying to perfect this, the incessant car, truck and bike din not helping," she thought to herself, "and I'm a little tired." She saw him nodding, and she guessed he was thinking about Mitchell, and the night gangs, the broken glass, burned-out car and the charred remainder of an oil drum, and blushed. If things had been different, if she were making more money by moving, not less, then she might have taken up Chandler's idea of looking into the free apartment down the hall for the 2 months that she had left. "I have a family to support," she'd said, when he mentioned it to her. "It's complicated. I'm just having a break, would you like a coffee?" Joe looked surprised. Last week she barely knew this guy, maybe their paths might have crossed professionally, once in a while. "Oh, well, I would," she began, then stopped, as she noticed another man standing a little way back. She knew him. Steve Silverman, who she knew from their first day of induction at Continental, and who she knew worked in computing. He tilted his head to one side as another computing colleague appeared. "Anyway, I did all I could, let's just hope that's enough. I'm due back down at engineering." "All right," said Chandler, stepping to one side as the nervous Joe smiled at him again. "But, do you promise me that we can meet for coffee sometime?" "Yes." She looked past him for a second, then back to Chandler. "Yes, that would be lovely. Thank you for asking about today, you're, well. Yes. One of the good guys, Chandler. Bye." And with that, a very tired and emotional Joe Lucas stepped past him, pushing open the stairwell door, her feet making a tinny noise on each step. Chandler turned to go, and was met face to face with Steve and also Andrew Waterman, a good friend. "Was that the English?" exclaimed Andrew, grinning widely, chuckling to himself and then, turning, to Steve. "Wow, you were close enough to see whether she was actually sewn into those underpants of hers, there." "Ah, ha," Chandler said, vaguely. It was the guys he always joked with. At first, it had been Andrew, who had got the job as systems analyst shortly after him, in the January of 2009, their joking was legendary, and very few topics were off-limits. Steve had joined in the September of this year. Chandler had recommended Steve as they had worked together on the drill at the Barnett Shale, in Louisiana. It had taken him about a week to fit right in with the two of them, and each of them helped the other two through difficult days. Like him, Steve was divorced, and Chandler could at least take solace in the fact there was someone similar to him who he could work with, who would understand him. Mainly, though, their jokes and banter were about other people. Once Steve had mentioned that there had been an English woman on his induction day that it had all began. It had been Andrew who had first commented about the English, as they were so apt to call her, building on the joke that she was so uptight she was a prude as she never went out with anybody. It had been various takes on the theme that had taken them through the last 3 months, but it had only been the previous Thursday when he had met the English, of course, and now Chandler was beginning to regret so fervent teasing of someone he hadn't even known. "What were you talking to her about, anyway, man?" asked Steve, clapping him on the shoulder. "I should feel sorry for her, if I were you," said Andrew, looming closer. "They say, there's going to be redundancies before the start of the holidays," he added. "They? You mean Michelle?" It was a well-known secret that Andrew Waterman and Michelle Smith, Bob Samuel's PA, were sleeping with one another. "Keep it down, man," rebuked Andrew, waving his hand as if it would remove the words Chandler had just spoken from the air. "But yeah," he continued, sotto voce. "Michelle. There's a list she typed out," he continued, looking around, "and it had a lot of names on it." "Who?" asked Steve, quickly, his eyebrows creasing into a frown. "Not us," said Andrew, with certainty. "Engineering is taking a hit, and we know the first in, first out rule," he added, tapping the side of his nose. "So you don't know for certain," Chandler concluded, as he looked back to the still-closed boardroom door. "Anyway," he added, changing the subject, "whoever it is will not be having the best Christmas, come December 25th. Come on," he continued, walking back along the corridor, to the right, stepping right between his friends and back towards their office. It would be a real pity for Joanna, as she was so convinced of the evidence of millions of tons of shale gas at the already explored eastern edge, with a family who relied on her. But then, he thought as he sat down in front of his screen, which still showed his updates, all their families relied on them. Whoever was going to be fired, he was sorry, everyone had families who relied on Continental, even his. At least, if he put in some decent overtime this week, and forgot about Joanna and her problems, he would be able to make good on his promise to Joey and be back in the city at the weekend. 88,888,888. A knock on the door of his office just after 6 p.m. on Friday made Chandler look up. None of his associates knocked. He ran an informal office, and, glaring at the code he was trying to finish, pushed the off button on the small DAB radio next to the server. If it was hardly able to make it Howard, of whom they all wondered how it was had got a job in IT in the first place, Chandler was sure he was going to do him over. He was more than a little surprised when Joanna Lucas was on the other side of it, smiling nervously. "Chandler," she began. "I'm sorry to disturb you." She looked around at the empty office, and smiled again. "No problem," Chandler said, holding the door wider. "Come in. I was just finishing up here. Well, I would be if this damned server wasn't so slow." He turned to look at the machine. If it had been alive then Chandler's look would have killed it. "How can I help?" No, she protested. "No help." She stepped in as Chandler closed the door behind her. "Chandler, I got it." Jo grinned, her eyes sparkling with delight. They listened. "I'm to begin work on it right away. I get to choose 2 engineers to help me." "You did? You are?" Chandler couldn't help smiling back. "This is great news, English," he said, his smile forming a grin to mirror hers. "See," he continued, nudging her arm with his, "I knew you would be able to do it." "Mark Hammond, right?" Jo said, pointing at the radio. 1984 this time, she guessed. Nodded Chandler, approaching his desk. He looked at the code, which seemed to be doing what he needed it to do, then stood back up. "Jo," he continued, when she hadn't said anything, "I've gotta go to New York tomorrow. I mean, when I say gotta, my friend, and my son, have invited me in exchange for missing, well, the 3rd Thursday of November. Would you like to come back to the complex and have a drink with me? I can drive you back straight after, tonight," he emphasized. "My flight leaves early tomorrow, and I don't want to miss it." "A drink? A drink?" exclaimed Jo's mind, as her mouth calmly said the words. "One won't hurt." "Yes, I'd like that. I'm buying, though." "Over my dead body," replied Chandler. "I asked you, English," he clarified, "so I'll be doing the buying." No buying, no one drink, no hurt, he added, a potential joke getting a little mangled. Okay. Laughed Joe, smiling at the man, who just over a week ago was a name on the telephone list to her. But only one. And I'm cheap, I don't drink. As they got into his car, Chandler helped her put her work bag into the back. Got a dead body in here? He asked, picking it up. Just work, she replied. I could have done that, if it was too much for you. I'm used to it, she added, unable to see Chandler's face. I find it easier to get a lot done over the weekend. You work your weekends? He asked, getting in beside her. Not much else to do when you're alone in a foreign country, she replied, smiling weakly. But at least it's paying off. If I don't go home at Christmas, I should be able to shave off the last 3 weeks of February. But, don't you got kids? Chandler asked, putting the car into reverse, and pulling out of his parking space. Yes I do, Joanna replied. But, it's this and getting a good future for them, or giving in and them having a mom wishing all of the holidays away while she tries to work, when I should be having fun with them. There'll be other Christmases. And besides, I'm head and shoulders above any competitors for the area manager job at Southport. This proposal, should it be successful, will only add to my chances, and then I will be able to move with them, and give them a good life. Now, tell me about your son. You say you're going to see him and your friend this weekend? Chandler nodded. What's he like? I have two, a boy and a girl. Adopted. Grown up now. Do they look like you? Or their mom? And then, a second or so later, Joe laughed when she realized what she'd said. That's a real Joey line, replied Chandler, laughing too. Joey's my friend who I'm going to see. I've always said it was a good job he was a great actor or he would never have made it. Yeah, he continued, as he pulled off from the Plants Road to the highway, turning left rather than right, as Joe's bus did. They both look like their mom. She was only a kid when she had them and put them up for adoption. They were lucky to have you, if they've turned out well. The clumsiness of the sentence dawned on her, and she tried again. What I mean is, I assume they've turned out well, and well-turned-out children reflect a good upbringing. I know what you mean, Chandler chuckled. We tried our best, even when my wife and I divorced. I made sure I found the time to see them, even when my job took me further and further away from the city. We were there when she gave birth. Wow, said Joanna. In the darkness, the road had run out of streetlights and the highway was lit only by the car's headlights. I wish I could say the same. You weren't there at the birth of your kids. General anesthetic. Emergency, both times. I can honestly say that I went to sleep pregnant and woke up with a baby in my arms. The questions that were forming in Chandler's mind he forced to remain in his mind, and he changed the subject. What do they do? My son's a writer and actor. My daughter's making a ton of money from YouTube as a beauty influencer, with her cousin. There's money to be made there, that's for sure, agreed Joanna, hoping she sounded polite. Oh, sure, for now. Remember the dot-com millionaires? How many of them are still around, I wonder? Oh, there's jobs in tech, I'll give you that, but making $1 million out of website addresses came and went in a heartbeat. But she's living with her uncle and aunt, and her cousin, of course, and she has a sensible enough head on her shoulders to move on and make it again once the whole YouTube phenomenon passes, and is overtaken by another one. They rode the rest of the journey in silence, after a few minutes of which Chandler had asked whether she minded he put in classic on the radio. It wasn't the classic Joe had been expecting. Instead of the likes of Beethoven and Vivaldi, it was more like the classics of Led Zeppelin and Bon Jovi. Once they got to the complex, whose existence could be seen, beaming out into the darkness of Newtown before they had even got nearly close, Joe's mobile vibrated in her pocket. Chandler had just pulled into a parking space when Joe opened the door, apologizing, and taking the rest of the call standing outside, with her back to the closed car door. Chandler sat there, waiting. She clearly wanted some privacy, or she would have been happy to talk in the car, he figured. He didn't have to wait long, however, and Joe went to get her bag from the back, just as Chandler realized she wasn't speaking anymore, and beating him. "Sorry, sorry," declared Joanna, pushing strands of hair behind her ears. "Bob has asked to see me first thing Monday." And? It was all that Chandler could think to say. "They are pushing ahead with my proposal as a matter of priority. Business decisions have brought this forward." In the lights of the complex's car park, Chandler could see her face glowing, her eyes bright. "We did it, Chandler," she added, grabbing his arms. "You did it," he corrected her, trying not to dwell on the business decisions bit. "I may have guided you but it wasn't me in that room the other day. I'm to get a bonus, in lieu of test fractures," she added, her voice dropping to graveness. "Yes." Joe did not respond to his prompt, however, only continued to nibble her lip. "It's complicated, my family life," she conceded. "My money for last Thursday can either get me home to see everyone when we have shut down. But if I stay, I'll be able to save that money and finish up here sooner." Chandler said nothing. It wasn't for him to repeat the rumor that his friend Andrew had told him. It was a rumor, after all, nothing more. And nothing would be gained by telling Joanna. "Come on," he encouraged, taking a few steps towards the nearest door. "What'll you have to drink?" "Coke?" suggested Joe, rubbing her arms in the biting wind, as she followed Chandler through the door and along a red velvet wall-to-wall carpet to the bar. "Or Pepsi? I'm sure I can get high on the caffeine." Chandler smiled as they walked past the room she recognized as the guest room that she had stayed in on Thanksgiving night. It was supposed to be for families of those renting apartments to stay in if they were visiting. Somehow, Chandler had convinced the janitor that she was a cousin arrived late to see him on Thanksgiving and needed the room, especially as the building had been practically deserted that night. Unlike tonight, which was looking to become as busy a Friday night as anywhere, especially when Chandler held the door for her, Joe felt decidedly underdressed in her suit trousers and ribbed jersey, no jacket, and thick-soled boots that she needed in the engineering building. "Here," Chandler said, pulling out a chair at one of the tables for her. Joe tried not to say something silly at the gesture, so unused to it as she was, and she waited quietly for Chandler to return from the bar, which he did about 10 minutes later. "Here," he said again, pushing a tumbler of ice-cold Coca-Cola into her hand. "Thank you," she said, noting the beer. "Budweiser. Proper American." "Proper American?" scoffed Chandler, nodding to the label. "It's supposed to be German." He sat down next to her, taking a sip, as Joe smiled, her gaze passing to the window which, had it been lighter, would have given them the view of the vast wasteland which was Continental's Bakken shale gas field, illuminated as it was by intermittent gas flares which released the methane and sulfur dioxide buildup in the lower rock strata. Few trees and plant sand, though not sandy, and not home to much vegetation and, as such, little ecosystem. "I noticed that had Guinness," nodded Joanna, approvingly. "Give me stout any day of the year, or real ale, none of your lager rubbish." She smiled, and Chandler smiled too when she lifted up the bud. "Well, let the lager rubbish toast your superior Coca-Cola to mark your triumph." They both nodded, and then he took a sip. Joe sipped her Coke, the ice cubes very cold on her teeth, but the drink tasted too nice to be sent back after a hard day and a hard week, if truth be told. Just then, her phone vibrated in her pocket again. "Sorry," she exclaimed Joe to Chandler, getting up. "It's my mum, there's only about 11 o'clock at home, I think. Do you mind?" "Not at all," he said, as Joe left her seat and, walking to the door through which they had come SNF, speaking with a finger in one ear, she milled backwards in front of the glass panel of the door as she spoke to her mother, every so often avoiding the incoming drinkers. "All okay?" Joe nodded. "She likes to check I'm okay. Is a massive risk, to all my family, me being out here, you see. They rely on just me, not," Joe broke off suddenly, looking at Chandler in alarm. "Anyway," she said, changing the subject, "I'm staying and shaving practically a month off at the end. It'll work out much better for us." She looked back at Chandler, who was trying to ignore the feelings of discomfort in his stomach again. And then, they talked. Just that one beer for Chandler as he joined her on the soft drinks, and at around 9 o'clock he suggested they borrow a tray for all their half-finished drinks. The bar was getting full and they could hardly speak loud enough without straining to be heard. "Okay, Mr. Bing, but no funny business," Joe joked, smiling. "I can look after myself." "That I've no doubt, considering where you live," Chandler said, pushing through the other door that led to the apartments. "Ah, that's better. I can hear again. Where were we?" "I was trashing the music of the 1980s and you were explaining why Kurt Cobain was a deadbeat music thief," she replied, following her new friend into his apartment. It shamed her caravan, that was for sure, although it was clear Chandler Bing had not been expecting guests. He would probably have tidied up. "Leave them, I'll get them," said Chandler, quickly tidying away his breakfast crockery that was strewn all over the living room coffee table. He then went on to collect some clothes and magazines which were also scattered around. "There," he said, "much better." Joanna put down the bar's tray of their drinks. "I have more Coke, you needn't have brought those with us," Chandler continued, his voice muffled by the fridge door as he spoke behind it, head within, moving some things around. "And Dr. Pepper? Or root beer?" He leaned back from inside the fridge, and added more clearly, "Or coffee? Tea?" "Coke will be fine," called back Joanna, perching herself carefully on the edge of the sofa then, feeling awkward, getting back up again. "I'm putting in some oven pizza, want some?" Chandler called again, as Joe looked around his sparsely decorated apartment. "Only if you're sure," she replied, looking again for any photos of his adopted, twin, grown-up children. "It is tomorrow you go to New York?" "Yes. Slenfield has a direct service. I'll be back Sunday night, then work till shutdown." "Yes," nodded Joe, as Chandler put in pizza. "Thank you," she added. "For what?" Chandler looked at her, sharply. "For the pizza. I could really do with some snap." "Snap?" "Oh, food. I mean food. I could really do with some." Nodding, Chandler rose from the oven, pouring out fresh Cokes before crossing over to her and sitting down, beckoning her to sit, too. "Can I just say, I don't normally make a habit of coming round guys' apartments who I've only just met?" She turned her head to him, her eyes earnest. "That's right," replied Chandler, whose brain had registered only the sarcasm in his sentence. "You put yourself in more danger by living in Chaos City." It was only after she saw her face fall that he realized that his words could also be interpreted as a hurtful dig. "I didn't mean it like that, Joanna," he said, frowning as Joe looked away. "I meant to convey that I'm sorry you couldn't stay somewhere like here instead. I'm sure your family would be reassured." "Your mom?" There was more awkward silence, then Joe looked back at him. "Sorry. It was very good of you to ask me for a drink and everything, but I would really appreciate it if you could take me back home now. Sorry about the pizza." "All right," said Chandler, feeling his heart sink as he got to his feet. It had been a great day for her, and he had made her feel bad. "I will, as long as you will do one thing for me." "Well, two." "Yes." "Stop saying sorry all the damn time, you've got no need to be." "Yes." "Ask Bob Samuels if you could have some of the money they promised you in lieu as an advance. There's smaller places here, you could offset it against the rent." Joe sighed. He was clearly trying to be helpful, and not all nosy or horrible. "Okay," said Joe. "I'll stop. As long as you do something for me." "MHHH? How about, instead, you stop worrying about my accommodation arrangements and be pleased to know the chest of drawers gets pushed across the door every night and I sleep with a rolling pin under my pillow." The look in her, steely and determined, made Chandler stop in his immediate attempt to argue. "I may have to live in Mitchell for 2 more months, but moving here may leave my family homeless." "Stay for the pizza, English," nodded Chandler, as he stepped over the coffee table into the kitchenette. "Then I'll get you back. And, I'm the one who's sorry." He looked back over at her for a moment, making sure the message got home. "All right," nodded Joanna. "Pizza would be perfection." Chandler stopped as if he had trodden on a thumbtack with bare feet, narrowing his eyes for a second as he glanced at her. She was just sipping her drink, however, and clearly her choice of words were a coincidence. 3 hours later, so late, in fact, that it qualified as the next day, and Joe and Chandler's conversation had moved from staid, through to jovial, random, surreal, and was now into the ironic. They were finding they had a lot in common, agreed on a good deal of things, music excepted, and were now heading into the zone typical of long, late-night conversations, which was philosophy. "I saw Trump in an elevator once, in New Jersey," said Chandler, nodding to the beat of something they did agree on, music-wise, crowded house. "We both did, my ex-wife and I." "And now, he's your president," continued Joe, her knees up to her chest, her socks and shoes off, leaning against the side of the sofa. "Don't put a dampener on things," moaned Chandler, rolling his eyes. "And we were having such a good night, too. Democracy is dead." "Not your favorite president of all time, then?" Joanna smiled over the rim of her glass. "What? Are you kidding? I woke up in 2016 and thought I was back in the 19th century. Or the 18th. We fought wars to get rid of jackasses like him. We fought you, English." Joanna widened her eyes. "Yes, I suppose this sort of thing is a big deal to you all, here," she nodded, putting down the Coke. "At home, years and years can go by without thinking about it. In the meantime, we have a government destroying itself trying to win independence from the European Union and making a ridiculous big zero of it." "Not a European, then?" "Oh, I'm a European. Europe's the continent. But, what's better? Being governed by an upper class, as we have always been, as your country fought for freedom from, making laws for us, an unelected aristocracy spanning centuries, or governed by an unelected elite who purport to make life better for all, yet unless you are fluent in 27 languages, how can you be sure? There's no difference now than in the past. Britain has always relied on the rest of Europe. Britain has always been governed by an unelected elite. Nothing, absolutely nothing will change, whether we are independent of Europe tomorrow, or whether we decided to vote again, and it came in as majority remain. All you can do is hang on, and do the best you can." "I suppose," nodded Chandler, in agreement. "Nothing much has changed under Trump, nothing much changed under Obama. It's the curse of what we are, Generation X. We work as hard as we can, and then some, just to stand still. We won't reap the benefits of our parents, we aren't of their time." "You're right there," nodded Joanna, yawning and looking at her phone for the time. "Anyway, it's getting late, would you be able to drive me back?" "What?" replied Chandler, too comfortable to move now. "Oh yeah? Are you crazy? With what I've put away?" He waved his hand towards the empty bottles of Coke on the table. Joanna laughed. "Unless you don't mind me stopping here? Your sofa looks comfortable. And it would take a few hours to feel any benefit from the storage heater." She smiled, not wanting to put him out. That evening had felt good. She felt like she was young again, hanging out with a friend. There felt no harm in it. Sure, agreed Chandler, moving up. "I'm going to hit the sack anyway, I'm off very early tomorrow for the city." "I'm sure you'll have a great weekend with your son," said Joe, getting to her feet. "May I use you, Lou?" "Lou?" Chandler frowned. "You know, the toilet. WC? Bathroom?" Joanna emphasized. "Oh yeah, sure," Chandler nodded. "In the cupboard in there you'll find a blanket. Night." "Night," Joe replied muzzily, as she made to the bathroom. "Use whatever you need," he called, as Joe closed the door behind her. And tomorrow, she could go back and face her mountain of work. Never in her wildest dreams did she think that her proposal would be accepted, by Bob Samuels, no less. She had until Christmas shutdown to prepare the operations protocol, including drill samples from the B2 layer, and most of her weekend would be taken up with that. That, she thought, As she balanced her phone on the sink, sinking sewn onto the toilet seat, still clothed, as she stared at the device. James would understand, probably. Timothy was a little small to accept she wouldn't be back at Christmas. But, when they were older, Joe knew, they would understand why she did what she did. It wouldn't change their circumstances, the awkward, difficult, elephant in the room issue, which inevitably tainted everything in their lives, but it would help. Leaving the bathroom, ablutions done, a tartan blanket in hand with her body slowly succumbing soporifically to the warmth and the darkness, Joe laughed aloud. Chandler Bing was asleep on his own sofa, mouth slightly ajar, snoring softly. She placed the blanket carefully over him, looking at the chair. It'd do, thought Joe, as she folded herself into it, contemplating the weekend ahead. She'd slept in worse places than the warm apartment of a colleague, who was obviously a very sweet man. At least he was going away for the weekend, for she was convinced that he would ask her to stay longer. And, Joe thought, as she closed her eyes, she may not necessarily have said no.